The moment somebody shows up at your front door and starts claiming ownership over something you spent years building with your own hands, you stop seeing them as neighbors and start seeing them exactly for what they are. I remember the morning Caroline Whitford decided she was going to steal my cabin like it happened 5 minutes ago, because some moments burn themselves so deeply into your memory that even the smallest details refuse to fade. It was a little after 6:30 in the morning, high in the northern Colorado mountains, one of those cold early autumn mornings where the air feels sharp enough to wake every nerve in your body the second you step outside. I had been standing on the front cedar porch tightening the final brass hinge on a custom hand-built window shutter, the smell of fresh sawdust still floating around me while tall pine trees surrounding the property moved slowly under a steady mountain wind carrying the scent of damp earth and freezing granite rolling down from the ridgeline above. The cabin sat exactly where I had imagined it 6 years earlier, when this entire place was nothing but raw untouched wilderness, 62 acres of heavily forested private land I bought after selling the construction company I spent half my adult life building from nothing. Every board standing around me had a story attached to it. Every beam. Every window frame. Every cedar plank running across the porch beneath my boots. I cut most of this wood myself. Hauled half the stone foundation materials up this mountain one truckload at a time. This place was never some vacation property or luxury investment portfolio sitting inside an accountant's spreadsheet somewhere. This cabin was personal. More personal than any house I had ever owned before. I had just set my cordless drill beside the porch railing when I heard the sound of tires climbing the gravel access road cutting through the lower pine ridge below the property. One vehicle at first. Then another. I turned slowly toward the tree line and immediately saw the black Range Rover forcing its way around the final bend near the front clearing, tires crushing loose gravel while cold morning sunlight reflected sharply against the windshield. Even before the vehicle stopped, I already knew exactly who had arrived. Caroline Whitford stepped out first with the same perfectly controlled confidence she carried every time she decided somebody around Cedar Creek Estates needed reminding who she thought ran this mountain. Blonde shoulder-length hair perfectly styled despite the freezing wind. Expensive beige luxury coat hanging neatly over pressed black slacks. Designer sunglasses despite the sun barely breaking over the ridge. Behind her another SUV pulled in carrying 2 Cedar Creek HOA board members I recognized immediately from previous neighborhood meetings I had intentionally ignored for nearly 2 years. Caroline wasted absolutely no time. She walked directly toward the cabin steps holding a thick stack of legal documents pressed tightly beneath one arm while her expensive leather boots clicked sharply against the gravel driveway. I stood motionless beside the porch railing saying nothing. She stopped exactly 15 feet from me, looked up slowly at the cabin behind my shoulder like she was already evaluating property she believed belonged to her, then gave me the coldest smile I had seen in months. "Logan, I suggest you start removing personal belongings immediately because according to updated Cedar Creek boundary enforcement filings, this structure now falls under Homeowners Association territorial jurisdiction effective immediately." For 3 full seconds I said absolutely nothing while mountain wind moved through the pine trees above us carrying the smell of cedar dust from the cabin walls I spent 6 years building with my own hands. Then Caroline tilted her head slightly and delivered the sentence that changed everything. "If you refuse to vacate voluntarily, ownership transition procedures begin today." For a few long seconds after Caroline finished speaking, the only sound anywhere around us came from the mountain wind pushing through the pine trees above the property line, carrying with it the cold scent of wet cedar bark, granite dust, and the faint trace of wood stain still drying on the porch railing I had spent most of the previous afternoon finishing by hand. I stood there staring at her while my fingers remained wrapped loosely around the cordless drill resting against my thigh, and honestly I do not think I even heard the 2 Cedar Creek board members behind her shifting uncomfortably on the gravel because the only thing running through my mind at that exact moment was how deeply personal this place had always been to me. Most people see a cabin and think vacation home. Weekend escape. Expensive luxury retreat hidden somewhere in the mountains. But standing there looking at Caroline with that polished expression she always wore whenever pretending authority automatically created ownership, All I could think about was the first day I stepped onto this property nearly 6 years earlier when none of this existed except 62 acres of untouched pine forest sitting under 2 feet of winter snow. Back then there were no walls. No roof. No cedar porch beneath my boots. Nothing except a rough piece of mountain land I bought after selling Mercer Structural Group, the construction company I had spent almost 18 years building from nothing before a national development firm bought us during a large commercial acquisition deal outside Denver. Most people expected me to retire somewhere warm after that. Florida. California coastline. Luxury penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago. Instead I bought wilderness. Because after spending most of my adult life surrounded by steel beams, concrete foundations, city noise, and contract deadlines measured in millions of dollars, the only thing I wanted was silence. Real silence. The kind you only find where the nearest neighbor sits miles away and the loudest sound at sunrise is wind cutting through pine branches 50 feet overhead. I built everything here myself. I drew every original design sketch by hand sitting at my kitchen table months before breaking ground. I drove thousands of pounds of stone foundation materials up these mountain roads myself during snowstorms that would have convinced most contractors to wait until spring. I spent entire winters installing insulation panels while temperatures dropped below 15 degrees and my breath turned white every time I reached for another cedar board. The heavy timber beams supporting the vaulted ceiling inside came from trees I selected personally nearly 80 miles north and had milled custom because I refused cutting corners anywhere on this place. Every nail inside these walls represented time I could never replace. Sacrifice most people would never understand. This cabin was not property. It was 6 years of my life physically standing in front of me. Caroline adjusted the thick stack of documents beneath her arm and glanced toward the cabin windows behind me with the same detached expression people wear when inspecting assets on a spreadsheet instead of looking at somebody's life work. I noticed then how casually she studied the structure, the handcrafted stone chimney, the wraparound cedar porch, the custom timber framing above the entryway. She was not admiring it. She was evaluating value. That was the moment something inside me settled completely. Because suddenly I understood this had never been about homeowners association regulations or boundary confusion. Caroline Whitford was not standing in my driveway because she believed there had been a mistake. She was standing here because she saw something valuable and had already convinced herself nobody living alone on a mountain property would ever fight hard enough to stop her. Caroline Whitford had one of those faces you immediately remembered after meeting her once, not because she was particularly warm or charismatic, but because every expression she made carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had spent far too many years believing authority automatically placed her above consequences. Standing there at the base of my cabin steps that freezing mountain morning, holding legal paperwork against her beige designer coat while cold wind pushed strands of perfectly styled blonde hair against the side of her face, she looked exactly the way I remembered from the first time our paths crossed nearly 18 months earlier. Cedar Creek Estates had always been marketed as one of those luxury mountain communities designed for wealthy retirees, second home buyers, and people who wanted the appearance of rugged outdoor living without ever touching actual dirt. Multi-million-dollar timber homes sat hidden along the southern ridge 2 miles below my property line, each one carefully positioned behind decorative stone entry gates, heated driveways, oversized panoramic windows, and enough luxury amenities to make the entire development feel more like an upscale resort than a real neighborhood. Caroline ran the homeowners association like it was a private corporation she personally owned. Every homeowner in the valley knew it. Nobody openly challenged her because most of them had already accepted the same quiet reality wealthy communities always create. The person controlling the paperwork eventually controls the conversation. I had seen the stories firsthand over the past year. Families fined because roof shingles did not match newly updated visual harmony standards. Retired couples receiving formal warnings after planting non-approved landscaping near driveway entrances. One homeowner forced to remove a custom-built outdoor fire pit because Caroline suddenly decided it conflicted with revised environmental compliance regulations nobody remembered voting on. Everything about her revolved around control disguised as neighborhood management. The first time she visited my property, she introduced herself wearing the exact same expression she carried now, smiling politely while pretending courtesy mattered more than authority. I remember it clearly because she spent almost 15 minutes standing exactly where she stood now, admiring the cabin walls, asking detailed questions about square footage, custom timber framing, energy systems, and foundation depth in ways that felt strangely less like curiosity and more like financial assessment. At one point she even ran her fingers along the hand-finished cedar railing and said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. Properties like this should really be integrated into larger community development planning instead of sitting isolated out here. I remember smiling politely while telling her the land sat entirely outside Cedar Creek property boundaries and would remain exactly the way I built it. Something shifted behind her eyes that afternoon. Not anger exactly. More like irritation that somebody had casually denied access to something she already wanted. Since then Caroline had made a habit of finding reasons to appear unexpectedly. Letters about environmental zoning updates. Questions about access roads crossing future community infrastructure zones. Invitations to homeowners' meetings I had absolutely no intention of attending. The pattern had become obvious months earlier. She wanted this property. More specifically, she wanted control over land sitting directly above Cedar Creek Estates because unlike everyone living behind her luxury gates, I had something none of them possessed. 62 acres of mountain property untouched by her authority. Standing there now while she casually informed me ownership transition procedures were beginning immediately, I could see the same exact calculation happening behind her eyes again. She was not speaking to me like a homeowner discussing regulations. She was speaking like someone who had already convinced herself the cabin behind me belonged to her long before she ever bothered pretending legality mattered. After Caroline delivered her little speech about ownership transition procedures, I slowly set the cordless drill down on the cedar porch railing and stepped forward just enough for the cold mountain wind to hit me fully in the face, carrying the sharp smell of pine needles, damp stone, and the faint trace of wood sealant still drying along the cabin walls behind me. For several seconds I studied the legal packet tucked beneath her arm because by that point I already understood exactly what game she was playing. The problem was not whether she believed she could intimidate me. The problem was how far she had already gone convincing herself nobody would challenge her. I finally looked directly at her and asked one simple question. Caroline, are you seriously standing on my property telling me you somehow own this cabin now? One of the HOA board members behind her shifted awkwardly, but Caroline did not even blink. Instead, she pulled several stapled pages from the folder and extended them toward me with the same detached confidence a bank manager uses while explaining mortgage paperwork to somebody too exhausted to argue. According to newly updated Cedar Creek territorial boundary assessments filed under Regional Expansion Compliance Review, this structure now falls inside active homeowners association management jurisdiction pending final administrative transfer. I took the paperwork but barely glanced at it because the first thing I noticed immediately was how deliberately complicated the wording had been written. Layers of technical language stacked together in a way clearly designed to overwhelm people who did not understand property law. Unfortunately for Caroline, I had spent nearly 2 decades running large-scale construction developments where legal boundary disputes happened often enough that I learned very early how to recognize paperwork built more on intimidation than actual authority. I handed the documents back without reading further. This is not a deed transfer filing. Caroline smiled faintly. It does not need to be. Community jurisdiction supersedes isolated parcel registration under specific expansion classifications. I almost laughed hearing her say that sentence out loud with such confidence. Somewhere above us a gust of freezing wind pushed hard through the upper ridge pines, causing loose needles to scatter across the gravel driveway while morning sunlight slowly crept over the eastern slope behind the property, warming the frost still clinging to the unfinished stone pathway leading toward the workshop shed beside the cabin. Caroline glanced over her shoulder toward the 2 board members standing behind her and nodded once. That was when I noticed something new. Parked farther down the access road sat a third vehicle I had not seen immediately when they arrived. A white utility truck. Survey equipment strapped visibly across the roof rack. My eyes narrowed instantly. Bright orange measuring stakes sat stacked neatly in the truck bed beside a rolled tripod and field marker case. Caroline noticed exactly where I was looking, and suddenly her smile widened just enough for me to understand everything. "We have already scheduled preliminary land reassessment procedures this morning, so I would strongly advise cooperation." I stared at the survey truck for several long seconds while cold anger settled slowly somewhere deep behind my chest. She had not come here to threaten me. She had already brought survey contractors onto my land before even speaking to me. This entire visit had been staged around one assumption. Caroline Whitford genuinely believed that if she moved fast enough, filed enough confusing paperwork, and created enough artificial legal pressure, I would eventually step aside and let 6 years of my life disappear into whatever luxury development she had already planned. Standing there watching orange survey stakes waiting in the back of that truck, I realized she had officially crossed the line between harassment and something far more dangerous. She was no longer trying to pressure me. She had started physically moving the boundaries of property she did not own. I stood there staring at the white utility truck parked halfway down my gravel access road while cold mountain air pushed harder through the towering pine trees surrounding the cabin, and somewhere in that exact moment I stopped seeing Caroline Whitford as another entitled homeowners association president abusing paperwork and started seeing her as something much worse. She had already decided my property belonged to her long before arriving that morning, and now she had brought contractors onto 62 acres of private land with enough confidence to begin physically redrawing boundaries she did not legally control. Caroline folded her arms casually and watched me study the bright orange survey stakes stacked neatly in the truck bed like she expected intimidation alone to finish the conversation for her. Behind her, the two Cedar Creek board members remained unusually quiet now, probably because even they understood this had moved far beyond normal neighborhood regulations. I stepped slowly off the porch and walked past Caroline without saying a single word, gravel crunching beneath my work boots while the freezing Colorado morning carried the scent of wet pine bark and fresh cedar shavings drifting from the workshop tools I left scattered beside the front steps. I stopped directly beside the utility truck and looked down into the open bed. 6 fluorescent orange boundary stakes. 2 metal survey markers. Tripod stand. Measuring rods. Full field survey kit. Somebody had come here prepared to physically redefine my land before I had even been given a chance to respond. Behind me, Caroline's voice cut through the wind with that same polished authority she always carried when pretending confidence somehow replaced legality. "Preliminary reassessment procedures need to begin immediately, Logan, so delaying this only makes the transition process more difficult for everyone involved." I turned back toward her slowly, and for the first time that morning I noticed something I should have recognized earlier. This was not random escalation. Everything had been planned carefully. The legal paperwork. The board members acting as witnesses. Survey contractors waiting nearby. She had already built an entire performance around creating the illusion that ownership transfer had become inevitable. I walked past her again toward the far eastern edge of the property where the old split-rail fence line ran through a section of exposed granite near the upper ridge. When I reached the clearing, I stopped completely. My jaw tightened instantly. More orange stakes. At least 8 of them had already been hammered into the frozen ground during the few minutes Caroline had been distracting me near the porch. They stretched in a deliberate diagonal line cutting directly across the northern section of my property, and what made my chest tighten hardest was where the line ended. Straight across the back wall of the cabin itself. I stood frozen staring at it while the reality settled in piece by piece. She was not adjusting boundaries around the land. Caroline had intentionally moved survey markers in a way that placed nearly half my cabin inside what she intended to claim as Cedar Creek territory. 6 years. 6 full years building this place one board at a time, and now some woman in a designer coat thought she could erase that reality by planting fake markers into frozen dirt and pretending paperwork magically changed ownership. I heard her footsteps approaching behind me. "Logan, I strongly recommend you stop interfering because by this afternoon updated measurements will begin formal registration review under our community expansion filing." I kept staring at the orange stakes running through the frozen grass beneath the towering pines while wind moved violently across the ridgeline above us. Then very slowly, something deep inside me settled completely calm. Because Caroline still believed I was reacting emotionally. What she did not understand was simple. The second someone starts moving fake boundaries on your land, you stop arguing. And you start looking for the evidence they forgot you would eventually find. I did not touch a single one of those orange survey stakes that morning because experience had taught me something most people never understand until it is too late. The second somebody begins manufacturing false evidence on your property, emotion becomes the fastest way to lose control of the entire situation. So instead of ripping the markers out of the frozen ground the way every instinct in my body wanted me to, I simply stood there staring at the bright fluorescent line cutting directly through the back section of my cabin while cold mountain wind swept across the ridge hard enough to send loose pine needles skidding across the granite outcroppings surrounding the clearing. Behind me I could hear Caroline's expensive boots pressing into the gravel as she stopped several feet away, probably expecting anger, shouting, or the kind of confrontation she could later twist into proof that I had become hostile during what she would no doubt describe as a lawful property reassessment process. I gave her none of it. Very slowly I turned around and looked directly at her while the first traces of early morning sunlight reflected against the cabin windows behind us, warm amber light striking the exact cedar beams I had spent 3 weeks hand sanding during the final winter before finishing construction. Caroline mistook my silence for surrender immediately. I saw it happen right there in her expression. That slight shift in posture. The small upward pull at the corner of her mouth. She believed intimidation had worked. Logan, I understand these situations can feel overwhelming when property regulations change unexpectedly, but cooperation now will make this transition much easier for everyone. I almost smiled hearing the word cooperation because standing there watching fake boundary stakes divide land I personally spent years clearing by hand, I finally understood the real strategy she had been building behind the scenes. This was not about one cabin. Cedar Creek Estates had nearly sold out its Southern Ridge luxury development months ago, and my property sat directly above the highest elevation overlooking the entire valley. 62 acres of untouched mountain forest. Premium views. Private spring water access. Perfect expansion land. Caroline did not want compliance. She wanted control over everything surrounding this cabin because she saw future profit attached to land she had convinced herself nobody would defend hard enough to stop her. Without saying another word I walked past her and stepped inside the cabin. The familiar warmth of cedar walls, stone fireplace dust, and freshly treated hardwood floors immediately wrapped around me as the heavy timber door closed behind my back, muting the sound of wind still moving violently through the pine trees outside. I stood motionless in the center of the living room staring upward at the vaulted ceiling beams I personally installed during one brutal January storm nearly 3 years earlier when temperatures dropped below 10 degrees and I refused stopping work despite ice forming on the scaffolding outside. Every inch of this place carried memory. Every floorboard. Every hand-cut beam. Every iron fixture I spent weeks custom ordering because I wanted everything perfect. Then I noticed something through the western living room windows overlooking the driveway below. More vehicles were arriving. 2 additional SUVs climbing the access road slowly through the trees. Neighbors from Cedar Creek Estates. Caroline had invited spectators. Of course she had. Public pressure. Witnesses. Social intimidation layered on top of fake legal authority. She wanted an audience watching me lose what I built. I stared through the glass as more people stepped out near the gravel clearing carrying coffee cups, winter jackets, curious expressions. Caroline stood near the survey truck speaking confidently while pointing toward my cabin like a realtor showcasing inventory already listed for sale. And in that exact second I realized something important. She had become careless enough to make one mistake arrogant people always make when they believe victory already belongs to them. She had started performing publicly before securing proof. I stayed inside the cabin for nearly 2 full minutes watching the scene outside unfold through the western windows while cold morning light spilled across the hardwood floor beneath my boots and painted long amber reflections across the stone fireplace wall I had spent 6 weekends building by hand 3 years earlier. From where I stood I could see Caroline Whitford moving between the growing crowd gathering near the driveway, speaking with the same polished confidence that always seemed to grow stronger whenever she had an audience watching. More Cedar Creek residents had arrived now, at least 8 or 9 standing near the utility truck wearing heavy winter jackets and holding steaming coffee cups while surveying the cabin with the kind of casual curiosity people reserve for expensive property they think is about to change ownership. Caroline pointed toward different sections of the structure as she spoke, occasionally gesturing toward the orange boundary stakes now cutting through the frozen clearing outside like artificial scars carved directly across 6 years of my life. Something about the entire scene immediately felt wrong beyond the obvious trespassing. I moved closer to the glass and narrowed my eyes toward a folding display board one of the HOA board members had set up near the survey equipment. At first I thought it was some kind of neighborhood planning map, but the moment sunlight shifted across the glossy surface, my stomach tightened instantly. It was a full luxury development rendering. My cabin sat directly in the center of the design. I stared harder. The original wraparound cedar porch had been digitally expanded outward into some oversized mountain lodge terrace surrounded by decorative stone seating walls. The detached workshop shed I built behind the eastern tree line had disappeared entirely. Half the surrounding forest had been cleared and replaced with landscaped walking paths connecting the structure to what looked like future luxury homes extending down the slope toward Cedar Creek estates below. And printed boldly across the top sat the words Cedar Creek Summit Club Private Residence Lodge. For several seconds I simply stood there staring while the smell of fresh cedar timber surrounding me suddenly felt heavier somehow, as if even the cabin itself understood what I had just discovered. This had never been about property boundaries. Caroline was not trying to fine me. She was not correcting zoning violations. She had already incorporated my cabin into future development planning. Worse than that, she had publicly unveiled those plans before legally owning a single square foot of land beneath the foundation. I grabbed my jacket hanging beside the front door and stepped outside again, mountain wind striking my face instantly while voices from the gathering crowd drifted sharply through the freezing morning air. Caroline noticed me immediately but did not stop smiling. In fact, her confidence seemed almost theatrical now. She wanted these people seeing me walk into a situation she believed was already decided. As I approached the crowd, several homeowners turned toward me with expressions I recognized instantly. Sympathy mixed with awkward distance. Caroline had already told them some version of the story where I was the unreasonable obstacle standing in the way of community expansion. Then I heard a man near the display board say something quietly to his wife that made everything click into place. The private lodge will increase all our property values by at least 20%. Property values. There it was. Caroline was not acting as Homeowners Association president anymore. She was using Cedar Creek Authority as cover while privately increasing development equity for the entire subdivision using land she had no right touching. I stopped in front of the display board studying the digital rendering of my cabin transformed into some luxury residence club surrounded by million-dollar mountain homes that did not exist. Caroline stepped beside me and folded her arms slowly, blonde hair moving sharply in the freezing wind while sunlight reflected off the polished black Range Rover parked behind the crowd. She leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice enough so only I could hear her over the sound of pine trees groaning high above the ridge. You should have accepted the first letter, Logan. It would have saved everyone a lot of unnecessary complications. I kept staring at the fake rendering and realized something very simple. Caroline had finally shown me exactly what she was trying to steal. I did not answer Caroline immediately because the second I saw that luxury development rendering using my cabin as the centerpiece of some future private residence lodge, the entire situation finally snapped into focus with a level of clarity I had been missing for weeks. Standing there in the freezing mountain air while Cedar Creek homeowners admired plans built around property none of them legally owned, I understood Caroline Whitford had moved far beyond ordinary homeowners association abuse and stepped directly into something far more deliberate. She was not managing neighborhood regulations. She was orchestrating a land grab disguised behind community authority, and judging by the confidence radiating off her while expensive winter sunlight reflected against the polished black Range Rover parked 20 feet behind us, she genuinely believed nobody would ever uncover how carefully she had been building this plan. I kept my eyes fixed on the display board while cold wind pushed through the pine forest overhead hard enough to send loose branches scraping softly against the cabin roof behind me. The rendering was too polished to have been made recently. Architectural detailing, terrain grading, future luxury lots mapped into the valley slope, expanded foundation redesign integrated around my existing structure. This project had been in development for months. Then something caught my attention near the lower corner of the board. Small print. Tiny enough most people standing here would never bother reading it. I stepped slightly closer and immediately saw the company name printed beneath the design approval section. Whitford Mountain Development Holdings. Not Cedar Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Not Community Planning Division. Her private company. I felt the first real wave of anger hit me then, sharp and cold like the mountain air pressing against my face. Caroline had not been trying to protect neighborhood standards. She had spent months using Homeowners Association authority as camouflage while privately planning commercial expansion onto 62 acres of mountain land legally owned by me alone. Around us, homeowners continued talking quietly, completely unaware they were standing in the middle of something much bigger than community development. I slowly turned away from the display board and walked toward the side entrance of the cabin without saying a word. Behind me, Caroline laughed softly, clearly misreading my silence again. I heard her speaking confidently to one of the board members as I stepped back inside. Finally realizing resistance is pointless. The heavy timber door shut behind me and instantly the outside noise disappeared, replaced by the familiar warmth of cedar walls, pine resin, and faint traces of stone dust still lingering from the custom fireplace mantel I finished carving 2 winters ago. I stood motionless in the center of the living room for several seconds, staring toward the lower staircase leading down into the unfinished basement workshop beneath the cabin. I had not gone down there in months. Slowly I moved toward the stairs, boots echoing softly against the hardwood floors while pale morning sunlight filtered through the upper windows and stretched across the vaulted timber beams overhead. The basement always smelled different than the rest of the cabin. Cooler air. Concrete dust. Old machine oil from construction tools I refused throwing away after finishing the build. In the far back corner beneath a steel shelving unit sat something I had not touched in nearly 4 years. A dented gray metal lockbox covered in sawdust and dried paint residue from the final construction phase. I crouched slowly and ran my hand across the cold steel surface while memory hit me instantly. The county survey records. Original parcel certifications. Boundary verification maps filed the week I closed on the land purchase 6 years earlier. Suddenly I smiled for the first time all morning. Outside, Caroline Whitford was still standing in my driveway performing ownership over something she believed she had already taken. What she still did not understand was simple. People who spend months manufacturing lies usually forget one dangerous truth. Paper trails have a habit of surviving long after arrogance makes its final mistake. The cold steel lockbox scraped loudly against the concrete floor as I pulled it from beneath the old shelving unit, and for the first time since Caroline Whitford showed up that morning pretending she could casually erase 6 years of my life with fake paperwork and staged authority, I felt something close to certainty settle deep inside my chest. Dust covered most of the surface, thick enough that I had to wipe the lid clean with the sleeve of my flannel jacket before reaching for the small brass latch I had not touched in years. The basement workshop remained silent except for the low hum of mountain wind pushing faintly through the foundation vents overhead and the occasional sharp creak of pine branches scraping softly across the roof outside. Somewhere above me I could still hear muffled movement around the driveway where Caroline continued entertaining her little audience, probably walking homeowners through development plans she had no legal right presenting. I opened the lockbox slowly and immediately saw the familiar thick manila folders stacked exactly where I left them after final county approval was completed 6 years earlier. Original parcel acquisition agreement. Structural engineering certifications. Environmental impact clearance forms. Construction permits. Insurance records. Foundation compliance reports. Every piece of paper connected to this property sat preserved inside weatherproof plastic sleeves because after spending nearly 2 decades in commercial construction, I had learned long ago that documentation protects you far more reliably than trust ever will. I pulled out the county boundary certification packet and carried it over to the old drafting table positioned beneath a hanging workshop lamp near the rear wall. The yellow light clicked on with a dull metallic hum and illuminated the spread of documents as I began flipping carefully through page after page. Parcel maps. Elevation charts. Federal terrain overlays. Original survey coordinates. Then halfway through the stack something stopped me instantly. A second folded document clipped separately behind the primary land survey packet. I unfolded it carefully and stared for several silent seconds while cold realization moved slowly through my head. Amendment request records. I recognized the format immediately. 6 months earlier someone had submitted a formal inquiry requesting reassessment review on parcel boundaries affecting Upper Cedar Creek expansion territory. My parcel number sat listed directly under review request documentation. That alone was suspicious enough. But what caught my eye immediately was the county processing stamp sitting diagonally across the top right corner. Request denied. Incomplete supporting documentation. I leaned closer. Beneath the denied stamp sat the applicant information field. Whitford Mountain Development Holdings. Caroline had already attempted this legally months earlier. She filed a formal boundary reassessment request through county offices and was denied before ever stepping foot on my property today. Which meant everything happening outside was not an administrative misunderstanding or newly approved jurisdiction update like she claimed. She already knew county officials had rejected her attempt to alter boundary recognition. Yet somehow she had returned anyway carrying fabricated paperwork, private survey contractors, fake stakes, and a public audience she clearly hoped would legitimize ownership she failed obtaining through legal channels. I sat back slowly staring at the denied filing while my mind started connecting pieces moving far faster now. Then I remembered something else. About 4 months earlier I had lunch in Boulder with Daniel Harper, a retired county surveyor I worked with years ago during a commercial highway expansion project west of Denver. During casual conversation Daniel mentioned receiving a strange private consultation request involving disputed mountain parcel adjustments near Cedar Creek Estates. At the time I ignored it. Now suddenly the entire memory returned perfectly clear. Caroline had been working this angle far longer than I realized. I looked back down at the denied filing request still sitting beneath the workshop lamp and allowed myself one small smile. Outside, Caroline Whitford believed she had spent months carefully building a trap around my property. What she had actually done was leave behind enough paperwork for me to start pulling the entire structure down around her. I sat there for another minute beneath the yellow workshop lamp staring at the denied county filing Caroline Whitford had apparently hoped nobody would ever discover, and the strangest part was not the anger I should have been feeling after realizing just how deliberately she had been trying to steal my land for months. It was how calm everything suddenly felt. The second I saw official proof that county offices had already rejected her boundary reassessment request half a year earlier, every question that had been circling through my mind since sunrise disappeared instantly. There was no misunderstanding here. No administrative confusion. No homeowners association dispute requiring negotiation. Caroline knew exactly what she was doing. And more importantly she knew the law had already denied her once. Which meant every fake document she brought to my property that morning had been created for one purpose only. Intimidation. She had built an entire theater production around convincing me ownership transfer was inevitable before I ever thought to verify the facts myself. I carefully folded the denied filing and slid it back into the protective sleeve before pulling out the original county certified land survey packet beneath it. The heavy parchment-style survey map felt familiar the second I touched it, thick official county paper with embossed registration seals pressed along the lower corner. I unrolled it carefully across the drafting table and stared at the parcel outline stretching clearly across nearly the entire upper mountain ridge surrounding the cabin. Every boundary marker sat exactly where it had been certified 6 years earlier. Every coordinate verified. Every acreage line intact. Most importantly, the cabin itself sat positioned more than 400 yards outside the nearest Cedar Creek Estates property boundary. Caroline had not simply moved a line. She had artificially shifted survey stakes nearly half a football field onto my land to create the appearance of overlap where none legally existed. I let out a slow breath and reached into my jacket pocket for my phone. The screen showed nearly 20 minutes had passed since I walked inside. Outside, muffled voices still drifted faintly through the foundation walls above while occasional footsteps moved across the front porch where homeowners were no doubt admiring development plans Caroline had already mentally sold them. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped on a name I had not called in almost 5 months. Daniel Harper. Former county surveyor. Semi-retired. One of the sharpest land boundary experts I had ever worked alongside during state infrastructure contracts years earlier. The line rang twice before his familiar gravelly voice answered through the speaker. Logan. Been a while. I leaned back against the workshop table and glanced down at the denied filing spread open beside the survey map. Daniel, I need to ask you something very specific. About 4 months ago over lunch you mentioned someone requesting private consultation work involving parcel boundary reassessment near Cedar Creek Estates. There was silence for nearly 2 seconds. Then his tone changed immediately. You remember that? I stared toward the concrete floor while cold satisfaction moved slowly through me. I remember enough to ask whether the person making that request happened to be Caroline Whitford. Daniel exhaled heavily on the other end. I cannot discuss everything over the phone, but I can tell you this. Whoever approached county offices regarding those parcels was pushing very hard for expedited boundary reinterpretation without submitting legally required topographic certification documents. I smiled slowly. That was all I needed. Outside, Caroline still believed I was cornered. She thought months of private planning had brought her within inches of taking everything I built. But standing there beneath the workshop light holding certified survey records in one hand while Daniel Harper quietly confirmed exactly what I already suspected, I understood something simple. The woman currently performing ownership over my cabin outside had made the one mistake arrogant people always make when greed starts moving faster than caution. She left witnesses alive inside the paper trail. After ending the call with Daniel Harper, I stood silently in the basement workshop for several long seconds while the soft mechanical hum of the overhead lamp filled the otherwise still air around me, and somewhere above, muffled through layers of timber flooring and stone insulation, I could still hear the low distant voices of Cedar Creek residents gathering outside like spectators attending some carefully staged ceremony Caroline Whitford had spent months preparing. I looked down once more at the original county-certified land survey spread open across the drafting table and ran my fingers slowly along the embossed registration seal pressed into the lower right corner, remembering exactly how seriously I had taken documentation during every stage of building this place. Too many years running large commercial construction contracts had taught me a simple rule most wealthy people eventually forget. Ownership only feels permanent until somebody decides paper matters more than truth. I carefully rolled the survey back into its protective tube before sliding the denied county filing request into my jacket pocket. The moment I stood upright, I heard something new above me. The heavy metallic sound of construction equipment shifting position outside. My jaw tightened instantly. I climbed the wooden basement stairs 2 at a time, crossed the living room, and pushed open the front cabin door hard enough for freezing mountain air to hit me immediately like ice against bare skin. The scene outside had changed completely during the 20 minutes I had been downstairs. At least 15 Cedar Creek homeowners now stood gathered near the gravel driveway in thick winter coats watching the property with open curiosity while the white utility truck had been repositioned closer to the front clearing. 2 men wearing reflective survey jackets were unloading additional measuring equipment beside the orange boundary stakes already planted across the northern section of the property. But what caught my attention immediately sat farther left near the edge of the clearing. Another truck. Flatbed utility trailer attached behind it. Lumber bundles stacked neatly beneath weatherproof tarps. Portable temporary fencing materials. Caroline had escalated again. She stood near the display board smiling while addressing the assembled homeowners like some luxury resort executive presenting the next profitable phase of a major investment project. The second she saw me step onto the porch, her expression sharpened instantly. Perfect timing, Logan. We are beginning formal site transition preparations now that the community board has completed preliminary review. I slowly walked down the cedar steps without speaking while every set of eyes in the crowd followed me. Frost still clung stubbornly to sections of exposed granite near the driveway, sparkling beneath the bright Colorado sunlight now fully breaking over the eastern ridgeline behind the property. Caroline turned toward the crowd and raised her voice confidently enough for everyone standing there to hear. As acting president of Cedar Creek Estates, I am officially authorizing transfer preparations for community integration of this Upper Ridge parcel effective immediately pending final structural repurposing approval. Several homeowners nodded approvingly. One older man even smiled while looking toward the luxury rendering board still displaying my cabin redesigned into the private Summit Lodge Caroline had already promised them. Then I noticed something else. One of the contractors had started unrolling temporary mesh construction fencing directly beside the front porch foundation. They were physically preparing to section off my own cabin while I stood there watching. Caroline folded her arms and looked directly at me with complete certainty burning behind her pale blue eyes. This was the moment she had been building toward from the very beginning. Public pressure. Witnesses everywhere. Contractors already moving equipment. Residents believing community ownership had already been secured. She thought the sheer weight of manufactured authority would force surrender before anyone ever questioned legality. I stopped 3 feet in front of her and stared quietly while mountain wind pushed hard through the pine forest behind us, carrying the sharp smell of cedar timber and frozen earth drifting around the cabin walls I spent 6 years building with my own hands. Caroline smiled slightly and delivered the sentence she clearly believed ended everything. If you have any final belongings inside, I suggest removing them now before formal possession procedures begin. I stared at her for one long silent second, then slowly reached down and tightened my grip around the old survey tube resting beneath my arm. For several long seconds after Caroline Whitford finished speaking, nobody around the clearing moved at all. The contractors stood beside their temporary fencing materials waiting for instruction. Cedar Creek homeowners remained clustered near the luxury development display board holding half-finished coffee cups while cold mountain sunlight reflected sharply across the cabin windows behind me, and somewhere high above the ridgeline a powerful gust of wind moved violently through the pine canopy, sending a shower of loose needles drifting slowly across the frozen ground where those fake orange survey stakes had been hammered into property lines that existed nowhere in legal reality. Caroline stood directly in front of me wearing the exact same expression people wear when they believe the outcome has already been decided long before anyone else realizes the game is over. She thought this was the final act. She thought months of carefully manufactured paperwork, staged public pressure, private development planning, and false authority had finally cornered me into accepting surrender. I looked at her calmly for another second before shifting the old survey tube beneath my arm and asking one simple question loud enough for every homeowner standing nearby to hear. Caroline, before you continue taking possession of land you clearly believe belongs to you, can I ask whether you actually verified any official county survey records before bringing contractors onto 62 acres of private property this morning? Something changed instantly. Not much. Just enough. I saw it happen in her eyes first. A flicker. Tiny. Barely visible. But real. Then just as quickly her confidence returned. Logan, this matter has already passed preliminary homeowners association review. We are well beyond discussing technical paperwork. I nodded slowly. That was exactly the answer I expected. Without saying another word I stepped sideways toward the hood of the white utility truck parked nearest the cabin and laid the old survey tube carefully against the metal surface while every homeowner standing around us shifted slightly closer now, curiosity replacing confidence as the atmosphere began changing in ways Caroline clearly had not anticipated. I twisted the cap loose slowly and pulled out the heavy county-certified survey map still rolled tightly from years inside the steel lockbox downstairs. The thick parchment paper snapped sharply as I unrolled it fully across the truck hood, exposing 6-year-old county registration seals embossed clearly along the lower corner. For the first time all morning Caroline stopped smiling completely. I pressed one finger directly against the boundary lines printed across the map and raised my voice enough so everyone gathered could hear every word. This survey was certified by Jefferson County 6 years ago, the week I legally purchased this entire Upper Ridge parcel. It establishes every permanent property boundary marker across all 62 acres surrounding this cabin. I moved my finger slowly along the coordinates. Cedar Creek Estates property line begins exactly 417 yards south of where we are standing right now. Which means every orange survey stake planted on this property today has been placed illegally on land your homeowners association has absolutely no jurisdiction over whatsoever. A woman near the back of the crowd lowered her coffee cup slowly. One of the survey contractors stared down at the map, then looked immediately toward Caroline. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the second document. The denied county filing request. I held it up directly in front of her face. And just so everyone standing here understands exactly what is happening, 6 months ago Caroline Whitford filed a private parcel reassessment request through Jefferson County attempting to alter these exact property boundaries using her private company, Whitford Mountain Development Holdings. I paused long enough for the silence surrounding us to become deafening. County officials rejected the filing immediately. Which means everything happening here today is based on paperwork she already knew had been denied months before she ever brought a single contractor onto my land. For the first time since sunrise, Caroline Whitford looked exactly like someone realizing the foundation beneath her entire plan had just started collapsing in front of witnesses she personally invited. For nearly 5 full seconds after I finished speaking, absolute silence settled over the entire clearing so completely that the only sound anywhere around us came from mountain wind moving through the pine trees above the ridgeline and the soft metallic clatter of loose temporary fencing material shifting gently in the back of the contractor trailer Caroline Whitford had so confidently brought onto land she never legally controlled. I stood beside the hood of the utility truck, keeping one hand pressed against the original county-certified survey map spread open beneath the bright Colorado sunlight while the denied county filing document remained visible in my other hand, and standing directly across from me for the first time since arriving that morning, Caroline no longer looked like the polished homeowners association executive who had stepped out of that black Range Rover believing authority alone could manufacture ownership. Her face had gone completely pale. The confident posture was gone. Her pale blue eyes moved rapidly between the documents, the gathered homeowners surrounding us, and the survey contractors now staring at her with expressions that had shifted from obedience into open uncertainty. One of the older residents standing near the display board lowered his coffee cup and took several slow steps closer toward the truck hood where the county survey map remained fully visible. "Wait a second," he said quietly while looking directly at Caroline. "Are you saying this entire development proposal was based on land you do not actually own?" Caroline opened her mouth immediately, but no words came out at first. Beside the temporary fencing trailer, one of the contractors removed his gloves and stepped away from the equipment entirely. Another homeowner began studying the luxury rendering board still displaying my cabin transformed into the private Summit Lodge Caroline had promised would increase property values across Cedar Creek Estates. The entire atmosphere had changed now. 20 minutes earlier this crowd had arrived believing they were watching a routine community expansion announcement. Now they were realizing they had been standing inside the middle of a fraudulent property seizure orchestrated by the very person they trusted to protect neighborhood interests. Caroline finally tried recovering what little authority remained. "This is being deliberately misrepresented. Logan is presenting outdated survey records that do not reflect current community development revisions." I almost smiled hearing that because she was still trying to improvise reality even after the evidence sat directly in front of everyone. I folded the denied filing once and slipped it back inside my jacket pocket before looking calmly toward the survey contractors who had planted every illegal orange boundary marker across my property earlier that morning. "Gentlemen, before you continue working here, I strongly recommend contacting Jefferson County offices directly and verifying whether any legal authorization exists permitting boundary reassessment on this parcel." The older contractor nearest the truck looked directly at Caroline for 2 seconds, then quietly shook his head and began packing equipment back into the vehicle without saying another word. That was when everything finally collapsed. Homeowners started questioning her all at once. Someone demanded explanation about Whitford Mountain Development Holdings. Another resident asked whether community funds had been used preparing private development plans around land the association did not own. Caroline stepped backward instinctively, visibly overwhelmed now as the same public audience she personally invited began turning against her in real time. I said nothing else. I simply rolled the original survey map carefully back into the tube and turned toward the cabin while the storm she created finally consumed her behind me. Nearly 2 hours later, after every contractor vehicle had left and the last Cedar Creek residents disappeared back down the mountain road, I sat alone on the cedar porch staring across 62 acres of pine forest glowing gold beneath late afternoon sunlight stretching slowly across the valley below. The smell of fresh sawdust still lingered where I had left the unfinished window shutter earlier that morning before Caroline arrived, believing she could steal 6 years of my life using fake authority and manufactured paperwork. I looked down at the cedar boards beneath my boots, ran one hand across the railing I built myself, and allowed one quiet thought to settle completely. People like Caroline always believe ownership belongs to whoever speaks with the most confidence. But the truth is much simpler. When you build something with your own hands, protect every document, and know exactly what belongs to you, greed eventually destroys itself long before it ever takes what it came for.